Hey everyone, Mark Meckler here, president of Convention Estates, and there is so much that happened in politics this week, so there's a lot to cover, but I'm not going to cover any of it. I know that was a little bit of a tease, but here's why. Once in a while, something happens out there that I get to see that you didn't get to see, but I have tape of it, and I get to show you. And this is one of those weeks you are in for such a treat. One of the best historians living in the United States of America today is, my opinion, Tim Barton. You might have heard of his dad, David Barton from Wall Builders. Well, I can tell you very much for sure the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Tim is as good, if not better, than his dad. His presentations are incredible. And we recently hosted him at an event in Fredericksburg, Texas. Luckily, the tape was rolling, and we actually have the entire thing, the whole speech, soup to nuts, on tape for you guys. And we're going to deliver that to you tonight. Now, I know that means you'll miss my commentary on the news. I'm sure you're terribly sad about that. But look, so much happens in the news every week. We'll be back next week and we'll do the news. This week, we're going to let you enjoy Tim Barton just like I already got to enjoy Tim Barton. So producer G, let it roll. All right, tonight you are in for a special treat. I really started studying history probably 10 years ago. I went to school in Los Angeles, California, so history wasn't a thing. It's California. I don't know what they teach us, but it's not real history. And then, I went to law school, and I realized in law school, I actually never read the Constitution in law school. Actually, most lawyers don't read the Constitution in law school. We read the cases that tell us what the Constitution means, but we never actually read the Constitution. So I had a really bad hole in my education, which is I didn't understand much history. And then I got introduced to wall builders. And I have one huge gripe with wall builders. So before I bring Tim up here, I'm going to air this gripe in public. Every time I go to the wall builders site, it's usually because somebody says, hey, you should read this wall builders book. And I go there and I get to the site, I'm like, and that one, and that one. Everybody's like, I got 10 books in my cart. And I'm not going to read 10 books this month. And so it's just too good. If you want to know American history, real American history, unfiltered American history, the true American history, I believe there is no better place to learn that than from wall builders. And I think, absolutely. And so there's some old guy that started wall builders. I can't remember what his name is. But in some families are just blessed that you have somebody who comes up behind. And, we're big fans of nepotism. I've always been a fan of nepotism in business. If you have competent friends or family, you should hire them because there's a level of trust that comes with that, right? A level of absolute, you can rely on this person. But, there's a bad kind of nepotism where you bring somebody up behind you. They're not really competent. They're just there because they're the kid of the person who started the thing. And that can be terrible. I have to say, I love David Barton, and thank God he's not here to hear me say this, and we're not letting this tape out there. But I have to say, I've had a chance to hang out with Tim Barton. I've had a chance to travel around the country with him. I've heard him speak so many times. I've learned so much from him. I love your dad, brother, but I'd rather listen to you any day. My friend, my brother, Tim Barton.
How do we preserve America? Obviously, looking back at the Constitution, we think, okay, what can we do to save the Constitution? Because the reason America's been one of the most stable, successful, prosperous nations in the history, even benevolent nations in the history of the world, is because we were built different than everybody else. This is something, there was a group of professors at Cornell University, and I'm going to get off the stage so I'm not blocking this for people. They wanted to know, what is the length of the average Constitution in world history? I might have already covered this. If you haven't, what they discovered after all their research was the average length of a Constitution is 17 years in the history of the world. Yesterday, right, we celebrated 238 years under the same governing document. The longest lasting, most successful constitutional republic in the history of the world. Right now, we could maybe talk about Israel as another nation that's had kind of levels of success we've seen in America. But with that being said, if we talk about the Constitution, this is also where I think there's some confusion in even some of the modern thought movement of preserving the Constitution, because the Constitution, it lays out the operational idea for how America functions, but it's not the thought idea of where America came from. The Constitution was built on the principles of the Declaration. And it's also interesting, back in 1892, there was a U.S. Supreme Court decision. It was a case of the Holy Trinity, but in the decision, they were talking about the way that things had been written by the Founding Fathers. Why were they written this way? Like, for example, the First Amendment. Why did they write the First Amendment the way the First Amendment was written? And what the Supreme Court said is, if we're trying to understand why they did what they did, we should determine the evil which was intended to be remedied. What problem were they trying to solve? Right? So this is why they were solving the problem. With that thought in mind, this is why it matters understanding the influence of the Declaration on the Constitution, because if we look at the Constitution, for example, Article 1, Section 5, Clause 4, Paragraph 4, neither house during the session of Congress shall, without the consent of the other, adjourn for more than 3 days, nor any other place than that in which the two houses shall be sitting. Why did we have to clarify that? Well, go back to the Declaration of Independence, when one of the reasons that we have this is grievance number 4, the king kept relocating the meeting house when we would send our representatives over to Europe, and all of a sudden the meeting's not where they were told it was going to be, so we're not being represented, which kind of leads to some of the thought of, right, no representation. That's why there was taxation without representation, all these problems. Every single issue that we identified in the Declaration was solved in the Constitution. But if you don't know what issue they were trying to solve, then you don't understand why that language is there and what it actually means. So for example, in Grievance 5, they dissolved representative meeting houses. So in Article 1, Section 4, Paragraph 2, we have representative meeting houses. In Grievance 7, they refused immigration. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4, we have uniform rules of immigration. In Grievance number 8, refused American judges. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 9, we have allowed American judges. In grievance number 11, standing armies without consent, so we restrict standing armies in the Constitution. Grievance number 12, no civilian control of the military, so we, in the Constitution, have civilian control of the military. You can go through every grievance. Every issue we had in the Declaration was solved in the Constitution, which led early courts to acknowledge the connection between these two. The Constitution is but the body, and the letter of which the Declaration is the thought and the spirit. So if you don't understand the Declaration, then you're not going to fully understand the Constitution. To go further, they said it's always safe to read the letter of the Constitution in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. Part of why that matters is because part of the movement to save America, to save the Constitution, what are we trying to actually save? And this does matter, because even the idea, if we talk about conservatives, well, you're conservative because you're trying to conserve something, right? Well, what are we trying to conserve? And this is where there can be honest debate and discussion. When the Founding Fathers got together, they had a lot of honest debate and discussion. They didn't always agree. In fact, at times they disagreed more than they agreed. But they were trying to get to the root of something. And if we go back and look at when the Founding Fathers are coming together, what is the common ground they find to come together? And this is where, well, let's back up and start with the Declaration. This was known as our national birth certificate. In 126 words, it's really the first and second paragraph. They lay out 5 immutable principles, and I'm only going to focus on 3 of those. But from this, we recognize some of these phrases. This is part of the second paragraph, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator. One of the things the Founding Fathers universally acknowledged is there is a divine creator. Now, this becomes quite significant in our modern culture, because one of the fragmentings we are seeing now in the political movement in America is, who is the one who is going to be in charge? Is it government? If you back up to World War II, FDR, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, all of them said what separates America from communism was God. Okay, you can go back and read their writings. In fact, they actually get into how it's Christianity, because it's our belief in God that makes us different. Because in communist nations, one of the first things they have to do is they have to remove the idea that there's a God who gave you rights. No. They say government's the one in charge. Well, the Founding Fathers have a universal belief in this. And why can I say universal? Because literally the Declaration starts off the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. What we see in the final draft of the Declaration was not what was in the first draft of the Declaration, which the first draft of the Declaration also super impressive. Go back and read it. But they had a lot of debate and discussion. It changed, and John Hancock, who was the president of Congress, said we're only going to include in the final draft what's been unanimously agreed to by the body, because if we put anything in there that we're not all on the same page with, the king might come and pull us apart by our own local separate interests. So we have to be united. So this was unanimous. Every single founding father agreed that we have a divine creator. This is also where, when George Washington becomes president, after Congress has met, there's 90 members of Congress, they come up with what became known as the Bill of Rights. There's initially 12 amendments they sent to the states to be ratified. States ratified 10 of them. When that gets sent to the states, Congress actually goes to Washington and says, we should do something special to commemorate that we've just come up with this list of amendments, sent it to the states. And the idea was we should have a national day of prayer and thanksgiving, that we should thank God for all we've accomplished. Washington does the very first ever presidential prayer proclamation. We actually have an original copy of this, which is super cool. But in this, his opening paragraph, which I'm going to put on the screen in a second, his opening paragraph is where he's acknowledging the obvious thing that we should all agree on. Here's part of what he says. He says, it is the duty of all nations. Notice the word duty, not part of our common vernacular today, but if you go back to Webster's 1828 dictionary, the closest place to go to see what they're actually meaning by the words they say, Webster's dictionary says duty is a legally binding, a moral, or a contractual obligation. So Washington says we have this obligation, legal, moral, contractual obligation to do what? Now, well, first of all, he says nations, which is also interesting, because he's about to talk about prayer, and he says we have a duty as a nation to pray. This isn't saying we have a duty as people of faith to pray. It's interesting. I'll come back to that. He says we have the duty of nations to do four things: to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits, and humbly to implore his protection and favor. He says this is something we all agree. Like, we have a responsibility, four things we need to do. Again, let me go back, point out, he's talking about nations. Why? Well, the Bible is pretty clear that God's the one that raises nations up, and God's the one that takes them down. God's the one that raises the king up. God's the one that takes the king down. And what the founding fathers believed is that there is a God, and because there's a God, and we know that God can raise and God can put down, and we're going to acknowledge God. So how do we navigate that? That in the Constitution, right, well, there's no religious test, and well, we could go a long way down that path, but here's the short of it. They say, in America, you don't have to be a person of faith to be here, but in America, we are people of faith, so we're going to acknowledge God, whether you want to or not. In America, it's just what we do. Okay, big deal, because they didn't require you to be a person of faith to come to America, but they were not apologetic about their faith here in America. I'll go further with that in a minute. Go back to this notion he's talking against nations, not just to people of faith. I think it's interesting, but it's because they had this clear understanding that there was a God, there was a divine creator. And if you follow along in the second paragraph of the Declaration, it says they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. The second truth I would say they quickly identified and rallied around is we have God-given rights. That's what inalienable rights are. And to be clear on this, if you go back to the founding fathers who were there, guys like John Dickinson, who was a governor of Delaware and Pennsylvania, he's also a signer of the Declaration, he explained it's a right which God gave to you and which no inferior power has a right to take away. By definition, every power is inferior to God. So if God has given you something, nobody else can take it away. Now, again, let me connect some dots. Why does this matter? Because had we remembered a little more of the Declaration when COVID first happened, and we had governors who were saying, oh, no, you can't, business, nope, well, you're done with that. I mean, literally, you didn't give me my business, right? You didn't give me my freedom of speech. You didn't give me my freedom of assembly. Those rights did not come from the government. They came from God. But when we forget the foundation of the Constitution built on the Declaration, when we forget that philosophy, it's easier to see the Constitution misconstrued and misapplied in ways that's not what that actually was intended to do. Let me go a little further. Alexander Hamilton, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, very noted founding father, He said, inalienable rights are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature by the hand of divinity itself and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power. So very clearly, right, something that comes from God. I think I like John Adams' definition the best, though. John Adams explained that inalienable rights are antecedent to all earthly governments. Rights that cannot be repealed or restrained by human laws, rights derived from the great legislator of the universe. So not only is he acknowledging these rights come from God, the great legislator of the universe, really fun term, he says these are antecedent to all earthly government. Well, that means our God-given rights came before there was government. Well, yes. If you are familiar with the Bible, God made Adam and Eve long before God gave Moses the law. Okay? There was God-given rights before God did government, which now should also be very, very clear that if government didn't even exist at that time, our rights couldn't have come from government, right? Our rights clearly came from God, and this is also part of when, if you look even in Scripture, the very first part of any kind of civil ordinance coming from God to man, a directive from God to man, how do we function government? It's part of the Noahic code, or the Noahic covenant, the Noahide laws, also as they're known. Well, the first one was, if man sheds blood, by man his blood will be shed. So if there's somebody that murders, then we're going to, society come together, collective, we're going to get rid of that murderer. God was working on preserving and protecting the inalienable rights of individuals. That was the origins of government as we see in Scripture. And again, those are part of the Noahide laws. You can go back and look that up. But if we acknowledge we have God-given rights, it's worth asking the question, okay, then how do we identify? Like, what's the numerical ideas of all these? Let's list them out. How many do we have? The Founding Fathers talk kind of openly about this in various letters. Sam Adams, for example, has a really good breakdown of this. He said, first, you have a right to life. Secondly, to liberty. Thirdly, to property. And, I don't have the rest of that quote in there. He then says, together with a right to defend them. He says, those are our first four, which we generally know: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Really interesting thought that one of the reasons that Jefferson did not include property actually goes back to some of the debates between even some of the northern and southern founding fathers, the anti-slavery, pro-slavery founding fathers, where Jefferson actually is the one who has some of the strongest anti-slavery language. He's the one that includes that all men are created equal in the Declaration. But he's the one that changed this notion of life, liberty, property, which goes back to John Locke, great philosopher who laid all this out. Jefferson said life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, just so we're not confused about what that idea of owning property is. Well, the idea of owning property actually went back to under the king. The king believed that you would own nothing and you would like it by 2030, right? The king believed, I own everything, and I will give to you, right, lords, nobles, whoever I give to, as long as you're in my good graces, but the government can come and take it away from anybody they wanted, and that's what they said. No, that's 2 of the 10 commandments deal with private property. Don't steal, don't even covet what somebody else's. So they said, clearly God has given private property to individuals, and so for the fact that the king thinks he can come and take all of our property, our family, our homes, our livestock, that's clearly not what it should be. Well, this is where they said life, liberty, property, and then Sam Adams' next sentence says together, or it's comma, the rest of the sentence, together with the right to defend them. But what they explained is that's only the beginning of the rights. In the Bill of Rights, as we look at, there's a lot more rights that are listed out, acknowledging some of the rights God gave. Of course, the First Amendment, there's 5 freedoms, and these are all a negative listing, things the government can never touch. The Founding Fathers in their writings listed probably 24, but then to be very clear, they said Ninth Amendment, but we believe there are more rights than we've identified that belong to the people. And just because we haven't identified them doesn't mean they don't have them. 10th Amendment, also to be really clear, there's a lot of things that belong to the states, and the government, federal government, can only do what the Constitution explicitly gives to it. The rest of those rights belong to the states. Well, that was their de facto way of saying, like, we believe there's way more than we've identified. We just want to be really clear on these. The government can never do these things. Well, this is part of this foundation. Now, it's interesting, as we talk about inalienable rights, the follow-up in this paragraph, second paragraph of the Declaration, they say to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The reason government exists is to protect our God-given rights. Again, this matters when people look at the Constitution. Because if we don't understand why did we do the things that we did? We had a separation of powers. We had 3 branches of government. We had checks and balances. We had electoral college. There's a lot of reasons they did what they did, but all of it was building on a philosophy that we need a government that will protect the people. and protect the rights that God gave to those people. This is their foundational understanding they unify around. James Wilson was not only signer of the Declaration, he also, 11 years later, signed the Constitution. He was appointed to be an original justice on the U.S. Supreme Court by George Washington. The University of Pennsylvania started a organized law training in the late 1780s. It was the second formal law school in America, and he was their primary professor. He gave a series of lectures. His lectures were then written down and became some of the first law books, American law books used in law schools in America. But it's interesting, at the time he was a sitting Supreme Court justice teaching the rising generation of lawyers. And here's one of the things he explained to them about the role of government in America. He said the principal object of government was to acquire a new security for the possession of those rights which were previously entitled by the immediate gift of our all-wise and all-beneficent Creator. Now, you notice there's ellipses. We abbreviated this. I would encourage you, go read the whole lecture. It's so fascinating, where he talks about the foundation of American law is built on the Bible. And it's built on an understanding of who God is and what God has done. Again, the whole lecture is fascinating, but part of what he breaks down is the idea that government comes from God. And this is where, if you go back to Sam Adams, I mentioned that where he says life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, or life, liberty, property, rather. The sentence actually starts, or that paragraph starts, he says government was originally designed for the preservation of the inalienable rights. And then his next sentence is first a right to life, secondly to liberty, thirdly to property. He starts off by saying that government exists for protecting our God-given rights. Now, I know at this point, I'm only trying to remind you of the foundation of everything that you're going to be discussing and talking about, and what we're ultimately trying to fight for in our states, trying to restore things in America. I want to remind us of the foundation, but it's interesting when he says that the first of the rights that we should be fighting to defend, he says it's a right to life. Now, this has become a focal point of conversation in the current political movement, because the thought of a right to life is what the pro-life movement will argue and articulate. That's a phrase they use. However, we know that language changes over time. And so it's always important to say, not what does that word mean to us, what were they meaning when they said this? And if you go back in time, it's really interesting to see what they meant. Now, I'm saying this a little coyly because we, for whatever reason, assume that abortion is a brand new issue, because in 1973 there was the Roe v. Wade decision, and the U.S. Constitution was overturned by a Supreme Court that said, no, we've come up with law, and law doesn't come from the legislative branch, it comes from the judicial branch. And so we are now saying that there's a constitutional right, a federally protected right, for everyone to have abortion in America. That was Roe v. Wade. Okay? And so we think in modern culture, well, abortion, right, this is a new generation issue. You need to take a hard pause for a second. Because for the history of the world, as long as there were girls getting pregnant, there were girls who didn't want to be pregnant. There were men who didn't want those women pregnant. For the history of the world, we have a book in our library. We have what's considered the largest private collection of original documents from early American history, from the founding era. We have letters and writings from every single founding father. Every signer of the Declaration, every signer of the Constitution, every early president. It's an incredible collection. But one of the books in our collection, this is Observations on Abortion from 1808. I'm saying this to point out, when they talked about a right to life, I don't have time tonight to go through this. I can go back to James Wilson's law lectures, where he talked about the laws of America protect the unborn child. See, the right to life, the phrase that we're familiar with, because of the way that our vocabulary has changed, or the way that we're being dishonest in vocabulary, it might be more accurate to say what they were talking about was the right to be born. The right to life is the right to be born. That's what that movement is. Why? Because if you're not alive, none of your other rights matter. You have to be alive to be able to enjoy anything else. This is what the founding fathers knew. Now, by the way, just to give you even more thought and context, if you are a person of faith, where does abortion first appear in the Bible? Exodus chapter 1. When there was a new Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Israelites were becoming too numerous. So he went to the Hebrew midwives and said, whenever there's a woman pregnant, I want you to go. And if it's a boy she's having, I want you to murder that boy. And the Hebrew midwives, go read Exodus 1. They came back and they're like, these women are so strong. We can't even get there in time. They're already giving birth. And, right, that, in modern culture, we call that selective abortion. And to also be very clear, where people would say, well, that's not abortion because those boys, no, we had partial birth abortion, right, in our era. But you also have what Tim Walz has done, where they rejected the Abortion Survival Act, where if a baby survives an abortion, they can receive no medical care. They are left on a table by themselves in the room until they die. And there have been 10 babies to count that have died that way since Governor Walz signed that. Now, I would call that evil, but let me point out, it violates the very reason we have a government. Government exists to protect our rights. The first of our rights is the right to be alive, because if the government takes that from us, none of our other rights matter, okay? This is where it starts. Government exists to protect your God-given rights. But if there is no God, there can be no God-given rights. And if there is no God, then you certainly don't have a God-given right to life, okay? I'm not trying to hyper-focus on this issue. I want to lay this philosophy out, because the Founding Fathers said we hold these truths to be self-evident. And these were the truths they outlined. Now, this is not all they outlined. There's more to the story than this. But this is where, when people look at the Founding Fathers today, I think so often, one of the mistakes we make is because we are familiar with their names, a lot of times we think we know the story, right? We think we know the history, and I'm not going to embarrass anybody tonight, but I feel like if we played trivia, we might not do as well as we would like to do, right? Because the reality is, familiarity has led us to a place of casual comfort, thinking that maybe, right? I mean, like Mark mentioned in law school, you're a lawyer studying all this constitutional law and you've never read the Constitution, right? Because that's how law schools go. We don't know nearly as much as we think we do, and even to this point. So as a person of faith, there's so many things we could talk about, but I just want to hit faith for a second. People have no idea how centric faith was for the Founding Fathers. Like, why did they believe there was a God and he gave us rights and government exists to protect those rights? Why is that the truth they unite around? Because the first time they got together, there was a painting done depicting their first meeting. This is the painting of the Founding Fathers' very first meeting together. Now, if you've never been to a prayer meeting, perhaps you don't recognize the posture. But this is a prayer meeting. Now, John Adams, one of the guys who was there, he said when we first met, and this is a letter to Abigail Adams, he writes Abigail, the letter's 11 days after this meeting. So he writes Abigail and says, Abigail, he says, when we first assembled, he said, Mr. Thomas Cushings of Connecticut stood up to make a motion. And his motion was that we should open with prayer. He says, it then was argued by, and he names a couple people, and we debated it for a while, and then Sam Adams stood up and he said, guys, we're being ridiculous. He said, we should pray. Now, by the way, the reason they debated it was because at that time, 9 of the 13 colonies had state-established religions, and primarily the colonies were divided between Anglican and Congregationalists. And so when John Adams makes this motion, or excuse me, when Thomas Cushing made the motion, John Adams writes about it. Thomas Cushing was from Connecticut, that's a Congregational state. But they're in Virginia, that's an Anglican state. Well, the Anglicans, that was King Henry VIII, right? That's where the Anglican Church comes from. And the Congregationalists are the descendants of the Pilgrims who left because of King Henry VIII. And that's where they're like, ooh, this could get interesting, right? Nonetheless, Sam Adams, Congregationalist, stands up and says, I'm no bigot. As long as the man fears God and works righteousness, we can pray a prayer with him. So Sam Adams recommends the local Anglican bishop, the Reverend Jacob Duché, come lead them in prayer. Reverend Jacob Duché comes, and the records of Congress, by the way, also the records of every guy who was there in their journals, they talked about this, that the opening prayer lasted for 2 hours. I don't know how spiritual you feel tonight. I would venture to say, right, if I was like, let's just the next 2 hours, we'd all be like, I don't think this is a good idea. I mean, like, I love Jesus, but like that's a long time, right? With that being said, these are not faith leaders. These are political leaders who knew they had to have God's help to accomplish what they were trying to do. Okay, let me go a little further. Because Sam Adams says that John Adams, right into Abigail, says that in the midst of their praying, that somebody suggested maybe they should read a passage from Scripture. And so they went to the book, Anglican book, Reverend Jacob Duchesne leading this. He opens the Book of Common Prayer, a book written in the 1600s that outlines, it's like a Bible reading plan, how to go through the Bible in a year. And so there were 4 chapters assigned for that day to be read. John Adams says, we read one of the chapters. He says, it was accidentally extremely applicable to our situation. He said, Abigail, I must beg you to read this. Now, the reason he would say that is because they didn't pick a verse they thought was really appropriate for their moment, right? They were just reading the Bible. He says, but it was as if God himself had ordained that passage to be read, is what John Adams wrote Abigail. Well, this is part of what he wrote in the letter. He said, I must beg you to read that psalm, read the 35th Psalm to your friends, read it to your father. He said, everybody needs to see this. Now, also worth noting, her father was the Reverend Joseph Smith, the pastor of their home church. He says, everybody needs to see this. Well, Psalm 35, just to catch us up, is one of the Psalms that David is writing while he's being chased by King Saul, where at this time, right, he's been anointed king, but he's not king yet. He's been on the backside watching sheep, and King Saul wants to kill him. And David cries out to God and says, I've done nothing, and yet he seeks my destruction. Lord, you rise up, be my shield, my buckler, my strong right arm. On he goes for more than 30 verses, and they read this, that this is amazing. Well, context. Also, they had just found out that the night before, that Boston had been surrounded, the harbor had been surrounded by a British fleet, and the British fleet had begun cannonading, bombing into Boston, which then makes a lot of sense why they're like, maybe we should pray, let's start there. But as they're praying, they read this, and they're like, this is us. We are David, because we've done nothing, and they want to kill us, and this is, and he says, this was accidentally extremely applicable, you got to read this. Well, then he writes her another letter. And he tells her what else Congress has done. He says, we've appointed a continental fast. Now, this is, again, the political leaders of the nation calling on all of the colonies to a day of prayer and fasting. He said, John Adams wrote, millions be upon their knees at once before their great creator, imploring his forgiveness and blessings, his smile on American council and arms. John Adams says, can you imagine if millions of people would just pray? Well, there's only about 3 million colonists at that time. So I think probably naively, John Adams is like, we're all going to pray. It's going to be amazing. I don't think everybody probably prayed, but it does say something about what he thought about their culture at that time, that this was going to be a people that embraced this movement. Well, it wasn't long after this day of prayer and fasting that we historically can track some of the action and movement. Actually, it's worth noting that what they did, calling for a day of prayer and fasting, is not really unique in American history. It's not something that is talked about, especially in modern history books today. But if you look just historically, by 1815, there were more than 1,400 official government prayer proclamations done by governors, by Congress, or by early presidents. At Wall Builders, we own more than 800 original prayer proclamations. It's worth noting every single founding father that became a governor did prayer proclamations, every single one. So anytime someone says, well, I don't think the founding fathers were really religious, this is the number one thing I like to point to. If they weren't religious, why did they pray all the time? Right? Also, the idea, well, they were atheists, agnostics, and deists. Okay, let's dive into that real quick. An atheist believes there is no God. An agnostic says, we're not sure if there's a God. And a deist says, well, there is a God, but he doesn't get involved in our world today. Okay, if they believe any of those three things, you know what they're never going to do? A single prayer proclamation. They did 1,400, right? This doesn't make sense unless they knew there was a creator who had given them rights. And government existed to protect those rights. They knew that God was real. Well, let me go back. The Continental Congress, just during the American Revolution, did this 15 times. And the first one they did was for prayer and fasting, but it was not long until after that they did a prayer and thanksgiving. Well, they went back and forth through the Revolution 15 times doing prayer proclamations. Again, this first one was for prayer and fasting, and it wasn't very long after this. John Adams wrote Abigail another letter, and he says, Abigail, it's amazing. He says, we have seen so many unlikely things happen. And in the letter, he goes through how he mentions several different towns and areas where the British attacked this town and the militia repelled them. And then they came and attacked this fort and our soldiers repelled them. And he goes through these unlikely things. But my favorite example, he says, we've just destroyed a 64-gun British man of warship and a 20-gun British man of warship. That was more impressive because we didn't have a Navy yet. A 64-gun British man of warship is a British vessel with 64 cannons. A 20-gun British man of warship, 20 cannons, right, made for naval encounters. We were British citizens. So the British Navy was our Navy. When we separate, we have no Navy. We have businessmen in America. They have ships, some of them for their business. So we took whatever boats we could find, literally how the Navy begins. We took whatever cannons we could find. We would put the cannons on the boats, and we would use those boats to fight back. In Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Museum of American History, up on the third floor, they have one of the very first ships of the American Navy. It's called the Gunboat Philadelphia. That's the Gunboat Philadelphia. John Adams says, we just destroyed a 64-gun British minute and a 20-gun British. And my question is like, how? Did you row really fast in their direction? Because like that looks like a John boat or something silly, right? This is where, as John Adams is writing, he says, it's amazing what's happening. Well, John Adams writes a letter very quickly after and says, Abigail, he says, I was eating dinner tonight, and there were men at a table eating dinner behind me, and they were discussing all these unlikely things we've been seeing happen, and they asked the question, how do we explain this? He says, and what they determined, I think, is the best explanation for what we're seeing happen right now. Here's what he wrote Abigail, is what they had determined that was the best explanation. He said, it appears to me the eternal Son of God is operating powerfully against the British nation. So they're like, how is this happening? Somebody's like, oh, I know. It's Jesus, right? That's what's happening right now. Now, this does not come from people who believe in a separation of church and state. That comes from people who knew we would never pull this off without God's help. And we've been praying and asking for God to intervene on our behalf. And so when these unlikely things happens, we know where credit belongs, okay? This is that idea. Well, this letter's from 1777. That's early revolution. So what have they already seen by 1777 that has convinced them that God is on their side? Let me give you two examples. And I could give you many more, but let me start with the Battle of Long Island. It happens roughly 2 months after the Declaration. At this point, the British, when they land in New York, they have approximately 30,000 troops. Washington has 16,000 in his military, but the Continental Army, he doesn't know where the British are going to go, so he divides the army, 9,000 one location, 7,000 another location. Well, just so happens when the British land, they start marching and they pin Washington's 9,000 troops to the edge of the river in New York. And while they are pinned, Washington recognizes we're in a tight spot. This is not a good scenario. This is also where, worth noting, at this point in military history in the world, everybody has a single-shot musket. Because there are some people that look at our modern military and they're like, yeah, but we're like all Navy SEALs. Everybody back then was like Mel Gibson from The Patriot. Doesn't matter. No, like it mattered. You're outnumbered 3-1, 30,000, 9,000. Everybody has a single-shot musket. This is a problem. To make matters worse, as they're pinned to the river, the British Navy begins selling their fleet up the river. And if that Navy gets up the river behind them, they're completely surrounded and they're done. They're going to be captured. Washington has to know in this moment that he's going to be executed for treason. Probably most of the officers are. This is a bad scenario, and this is when the first of the unlikely event happens. It was a clear day. And out of nowhere, a storm comes rolling in. And the storm is so bad that the British Navy calls their fleet back out of the river because they don't want their ships to go up aground, to hit rocks, to sink. So they call the Navy back. But Washington now recognizing, okay, if those ships get behind us, we're done. Washington puts out word to his men, go find anything you can that floats. The reason was back then most Americans, number one, didn't know how to swim. Number two, was a mile to the other side of the river. So even if you could swim, that's a long swim. So he says, find anything that floats. So that night they begin looking. Also significant is when the sun set, the storm calmed. Now, it's still raining a little bit, but it wasn't crazy. And that matters because if you're finding like canoes and flat bottom boats, which they did, you have to go a mile across. And if you're doing a big storm, that's a problem. Well, the storm calmed. So they begin that night evacuating all night long, across and back, across 9,000 troops. There's only so many you're putting in a canoe, right? And they got to go across and back. Well, as they do this all night, they're evacuating. As the next morning begins to come, there's more than 1,000 Americans left. Washington is still there because Washington has said he's going to be the last one off the island. And you can imagine some of his officers were protesting, sir, we got to get you off. And he said, that's not the kind of leader I am. I'm not abandoning the troops. I'm going to make sure that they get off and then I will get off. So Washington is still there. So they're evacuating all night long. The next morning, 1,000 troops left. What are we going to do? And this is where, like, again, more unlikely things happen. There's a fog that lifts off the river. Now, that's not unlikely, except the fog blows and stops between both camps. Okay? One of the guys who was there, his name was Major Benjamin Talmadge. Major Benjamin Talmadge was the guy that went on to become the head of the Culper Spy Ring, one of the most famous spy rings in American history. This is what he said about that morning. He said, a very dense fog began to rise, and it seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well, and so very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. Right? So, like, from me to the front row, he's like, we couldn't even see people. The fog was so thick. Well, the fog was thick between both camps. So the Americans continue on their ships. Over and back, over and back. When they load the last 3 ships, the last 3 little boats, the last 3 boats get in the middle of the water, and then the fog lifts. The British look and realize the camp is empty. They charge the camp. The British historians, the British officers noted that we got to the edge of the river in time to see 3 ships arrive on the other side and unload on the other side. The Americans had escaped to fight another day. The 3 ships they saw, Washington said he's going to be the last one off the island. They watched George Washington unload on the other side. And it was only after the fact that somebody was like, okay, wait a second, tell me that story again, because that seems odd. So you're saying, like, it was a clear day, Navy fleet's coming up and a storm blows in, okay, and then the storm calms only once it's dark, because then they can't sail up again, and then so you're evacuating, you're not going to make it in time, and the fog comes, and that's not unusual, but it settles in both encampments, and it stays there until you load the last 3 boats, you get to the middle, and the fog lifts, and like, that was so lucky for you guys. Now, you could have said it was lucky if it only happened once, but this kind of stuff started happening over and over again, that people are like, I think something else is going on. Just to give you an example, okay? And I'm giving you obvious examples. And these are things that happened before John Adams writes this letter. If you go to December 1776, at this point, the Americans have done nothing but lose. Now, they've survived. God has kept them alive, but all they've done is lose to this point. And so, starting with the Battle of Long Island, we just talked about, they lost that. They lose the Battle of Kips Bay. They lose at White Plains. They lose at Fort Washington. They lose Fort Lee. They lose all of New York. Part of why this is the problem is back then in the Continental Army, there was 1-year enlistments, and everybody's enlistment is up in December. No matter when you sign up, your enlistment's over in December. Washington is trying to get people to sign up for round 2, because if we don't sign up again, there can be no continuation. We'll never win this because we don't have soldiers to fight. So he's got to get people to sign up, and all they've done is lose over and over. It's like being a Dallas Cowboy fan in the playoffs. It's the worst. Right? Like, all you do is lose. Why do we even care? It's ridiculous, right? Washington has this dilemma. How do we motivate people to get involved? And, again, to give perspective, morale is at an incredibly low point in American history for the military. You already have people that are deserting because there's people reasoning, rationalizing, saying, well, why am I staying cold in winter quarters when I can go home and be with my wife and my kids, and I can go to my own home where there's a fire in the fireplace? Why am I here being cold? So people are deserting, and he can't get anybody to sign up for round 2. Washington knows we have to change perspective. And part of Washington thinks is we have to have a victory, because without a victory, then people won't have hope that we can continue on. We have to have a victory. So his idea was, on Christmas night, we're going to march on one of the close forts to us, Fort Trenton. And Trenton was not going to be an easy thing necessarily, because Trenton was being controlled, run, operated by the Hessians. The Hessians were the German mercenaries who were very good soldiers. But Washington's idea was interesting. He said, we're going to go on Christmas night. Why does that matter? Well, the Hessians were known that they did like to celebrate on certain occasions, right? So Washington was like, well, what if we just pick a night when they're all going to be drinking? We show up the next morning and they all got hangovers. Like, it's perfect. It's actually not a bad strategy. Like, if you had to pick a fight with somebody, wait till they're drunk and you had a better chance, maybe, right? This is kind of the thought. Well, this is the idea. They're going to march on Trenton. It's where the Hessians are. The Hessians, there's between 12 and 1,500 to their understanding based on their reports. That's what their knowledge is about how many Hessians are going to be there. And Washington's idea is, as we cross over on Christmas night. Now, the guy who was actually in charge of the crossing when they got across was General Knox. And I'm going to come back to him in a minute because he wrote a letter we're going to talk about in a second. But Washington's idea was they were going to have 3 crossing locations in the Delaware. From those 3 locations, they were going to get 5,400 troops across. They're going to have cannons and horses forces with them, and they're going to be across by midnight. Washington did not think through, maybe not his fault, could have been anybody else who oversight as well, but they did not understand that crossing a river in New York in wintertime was going to be as difficult as it was. Well, in Washington's location alone, they were so delayed by ice flows that Washington was able to get 2,400 troops across, but they did not get across till 4 a.m. They're supposed to be across by midnight because they still got a 9-mile march once they get across. They didn't get across till 4 a.m. Well, there's no way you're marching 9 miles with all your troops and getting in position before dawn of the next day, and he doesn't find out until he's across that the other 2 locations, nobody got across. We're the only ones. So he went from 5,400 troops down to 2,400, and he says, well, we have no options. If we don't get a victory, there will be no round 2. We have to march on. So they decide they're going to march on. So all night long, they march on. Now, there's no way they're going to make it before the dawn, but they're going to advance. To make matters worse, as they're making this 9-mile trek, a blizzard rolls in on them. And at this point in American history, this is part of already the saga is there that some of the soldiers have already worn through their boots. They don't have on winter clothes. The British said, even at this point, the British said they could track the movement of the American soldiers in wintertime by their bloody footprints in the snow. Already in 1776, they're writing that. So this is a brutal condition. In fact, we know it was so bad that during the march, there were actually 2 men that froze to death during that march. Well, you might, if you were one of the Americans, go, God, why? Right? We're trying to do a good thing. Why are we having to deal with this? What they didn't know is that as the blizzard rolled in, the sentries on duty at Trenton, they went to their CO and they said, sir, nobody's crazy enough to be out doing operations in this kind of weather. Can we please come in and stay warm? And their CO agreed, said, yeah, nobody's moving tonight. You guys come in and stay warm. The Americans were never going to make it before sunrise. But all of a sudden, there's nobody watching the road. There's nobody watching the fort. And Washington and his men are able to get up with no sentries on duty and surround the fort in position by 8 a.m. Now, after they're in position, the Hessians are entrenched inside of the fort. Keep that in mind. When they're in position, they announce themselves. It's a complete surprise. Here's what's crazy. The Hessians, they don't want to be surrounded because then they know they're trapped. They abandon the fort. They were in an entrenched position. The soldiers announce themselves, open fire, and all the Hessians run out in the open. And so now they're not in an entrenched position. The battle lasts 35 minutes. You're in an entrenched position, and they abandoned it. Makes no sense at all, right? It didn't make sense. Well, what continues to not make sense is when you look at the result of this. Now, the Hessians were fighting on Team Britain. So on the British side, there were approximately 20 killed, 100 wounded, and 1,000 captured. On the American side, there were 3 wounded. Period. And again, this is when people were like, whoa, well, that worked pretty well, right? That was great. Let me give it even more context. Because of the 3 that were wounded, one of them goes on to become a pretty famous American. And to give some of this story, he was a young officer. When Washington is going into Trenton, he put a small detachment on the edge of town to make sure there were no loyalists who ran out of town to go get, right, kind of a backup team, British coming in. So we got to make sure that we don't let anybody leave town. So there's a small detachment, go to the edge of town. He is a young officer in that detachment. As they're marching to the edge of town, there is a dog that begins barking in one of the townhouses. A man answers the door. His name was Dr. John Riker. Dr. John Riker answers the door. They say, sir, we mean you no harm. Stay inside. We're the Americans. We're just making sure we're guarding, make sure nobody leaves. But if you stay inside, no harm will come to you. He said, hey, I'm on your side. I'm Team Patriot. He says, but I'm also a doctor. And if there's going to be operations at Trenton, he says, I want to come with you. Some poor fellow may need my assistance. So he got his medical kit. He joins a small detachment. Well, when the battle begins, small detachment goes back, and they join in this battle. As they go back, this young officer, as he steps up in the battle, he gets shot in the shoulder. The ball goes in, nicks an artery. He's bleeding out. Just so happens the guy standing beside him is the doctor. He was the only one that had a wound that was life-threatening. The doctor beside him, both of them wrote about this. The doctor took his finger, put it in the hole, starts giving orders. He saves this guy's life. Well, who was this guy? If you ever see the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, he's the one standing behind George Washington. That's a known man, known individuals that are in that boat, by the way. But that man goes on to become the 5th president. His name was James Monroe. This is when people looked back and they're like, okay, let's walk through this again. So you're telling me that the only dog that barked was the dog that belonged to the doctor. And the doctor standing beside the only guy who received what could have been a fatal wound and puts his finger like, this is pretty interesting. This is what they begin to see over and over and over again, so much so that just a year and a half later, George Washington, let me finish this thought. I was already jumping ahead. So George Washington talked about the total victory. In fact, when he talked about the American Revolution, he mentioned God's providence on 250 occasions in his letters about the American Revolution alone. So they were so open about how God had intervened and helped them along the way. But I mentioned General Henry Knox. He was the guy in charge of the crossing where Washington was. He wrote about that morning. Here's part of what he wrote. The hurry, fright, and confusion of the enemy was not unlike that which will be when the last trump will sound, which is a reference to something that the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians. He said, Providence seemed to have smiled upon every part of this enterprise. Everybody who was there that wrote about it talked about how obvious it was to them that God had helped them in what they had done. Now, there's so many significant connection points from this, but let me now, a year and a half later, George Washington writes this. He's writing to General Thomas Nelson Jr., and actually, he's writing about how obvious it is that God has been helping them to this point, okay, just that context. He says, the hand of providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith and more than wicked that has not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. He said, if anybody sees what we've been seeing, if they can't acknowledge that God has been helping us, you must be worse than a non-believer infidel or more than wicked if you can't acknowledge what God has done. His next line is my favorite. He says, but it will be time enough for me to turn preacher when my present appointment ceases, and therefore I shall add no more on the doctrine of providence. He's like, I've seen enough miracles, I could become a pastor. But for now, I'm going to try to win this war, right? Like, this is his sentiment. Again, the reason this matters is because it was so clear to them that God was intervening, but why would that be a surprise? Because they've been praying for this very thing to happen with these days of prayer and fasting or days of prayer and thanksgiving. Like, this is exactly what they wanted, was for God to help in their endeavors. Now, also, when Washington talks about how obvious God's providence has been and how the miracles are so apparent to people to pay attention, Washington really understood this better than most. Because if you back up in Washington's life, Washington was a guy back in the French and Indian War. He was 23 years old. He was a colonel in the French and Indian War. The famous battle was the Battle of the Monongahela, where there were more British. They were going to take a French outpost, and the French and Indians attacked this British force, which at that time, 1755, Americans, we were British colonies, and Washington was a young colonel. But as this battle happens from the French and Indian War, the Battle of Monongahela, every single British officer was shot off horseback and killed, except one. George Washington was the only one, the only officer not shot down off horseback. Now, he had 2 horses shot from under him, but he was not killed. In fact, as the British were being massacred because they didn't understand how to fight in any kind of woodland fighting, they thought you stand in the open in the middle of the field, and all the French and Indians were hiding behind trees up on the hillside, and so it was an absolute massacre. Washington's telling them the whole time, this is a mistake, don't fight like this. But once finally General Braddock is shot, Washington is now the senior officer as a 23-year-old colonel, because everybody else is dead and gone. So Washington says, all right, guys, we're out of here, calls the retreat. Well, they end up leaving, and when they get back to the fort, kind of tail between their legs, they get back, Washington finds out that his mom has gotten word that he was killed in the battle. So he writes his mom a letter and says, Mom, the stories of my death have been a bit exaggerated. I now am alive. I'm totally good. But what's interesting, in part of this letter, he says, I now exist and appear in the land of the living by the miraculous care of Providence that protected me beyond all human probability or expectation. I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt. Now, many of you in this room are wearing coats. 4 bullets in your, whoop, 1, 2. Right, like at some point you're like, okay, I don't know what happened here. This story gets even better, because that was 1755. Well, about 15 years later, he is back in a similar area of the woods with a good friend, Dr. Joseph Crick. They're exploring the woods, and that evening, when they're getting ready to set up camp, a group of natives come and approach them. These Indian braves come up, and actually, lots of feathers and headdresses, and well, it turns out it's several chiefs. And they come up, and the first chief says, "You don't know me, but we were in these woods many years ago." He says, "I knew exactly who you were." He says, "We knew if we could kill the officers, we could scatter the troops." He said, we personally targeted you, fired at you. Here's part of what he said. He said, "I called to my young men and said, 'Quick, let your aim be certain.' And he dies. Our rifles were leveled, rifles which, but for you, knew not how to miss. 'Twas all in vain. A power mightier far than we shielded you. I am come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle." That was the first chief. Second chief steps up and says, "Okay." He says, "I never miss. My warriors knew whatever I shoot goes down." He says, "I had so many open shots at you, and you just would not die." He said, "Washington was never born to be killed by a bullet. I had 17 fair fires at him with my rifle, and after all, could not bring him to the ground." What's interesting about this, now, by the way, if you want to know the full story, we do have on our website a book titled The Bulletproof George Washington, where we go through this story. But it's interesting. After this happened in 1755, the most famous pastor in Virginia was the Reverend Samuel Davies. He preached a sermon, Religion and Patriotism, the Constituents of a Good Soldier. And in this sermon, talking about how God at times will intervene in war and help soldiers, he has an asterisk as he goes through this. And it's here at the bottom. It's a little hard to read, so I'm going to make it a little larger. As a remarkable instance of this, I may point out to the public that heroic youth Colonel Washington, whom I cannot but hope Providence has hitherto preserved in so signal a manner for some important service to his country. They said, God saved George Washington for a reason. I wonder why God saved him. Now, I don't know if we can apply that today, but I think historically there's some interesting connections, right? I'm not saying he's George Washington. But I'm saying it's interesting that we have a lot of moments where you can track God's providence in protecting and keeping people alive. And Samuel Davies said, I think the reason God kept George Washington alive is because God's going to use him for something significant. Okay, so when the revolution finally comes to an end, the Peace Treaty of Paris is signed by these three guys. On the left is John Jay, the middle is John Adams, the right is Benjamin Franklin. The Peace Treaty you see at the top left is 10 articles. On the bottom left, David Hartley was the British ambassador. Then John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay. This is the document that ended the American Revolution, brought peace between us and Great Britain, and established America as a free and independent nation. It's still on display in Washington, D.C. in the State Department on the John Quincy Adams State Drawing Room. Look at the title of this document. In the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. Do you know America became a nation in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit? That's the weirdest title for a document I've ever seen. It's a peace treaty document. Oh, it's weird. But it's possible somebody had read Proverbs 3 recently. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your steps. Because they put his name right at the top. The reason all of this matters is the founding fathers were far more faith-oriented than most people give them credit for. And in fact, when George Washington was done with his political career, the last thing he did in politics was the farewell address. And in the farewell address, there's a phrase you will be familiar with, I think. And he said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity. Now, political prosperity, we're talking about success as a nation. What makes a nation successful? He says, of all the things we could do, of all the habits, of all the dispositions which could contribute to America being a great nation, he said religion and morality are the indispensable supports. If you read the entire farewell address, he gives lots of advice on a lot of things, and some really good things, right? Avoid foreign entanglements, avoid debt, love, policies, and principles more than parties. I mean, so many good pieces of advice. There's only once he says something is an indispensable support. That means you cannot do it. If America's going to survive, you cannot do it without this. He said religion and morality. Next line, he says, in vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. Anybody that opposes religion and morality is not a patriot, meaning they don't love their nation. You don't love America if you oppose religion and morality. Well, this is George Washington, last political thing he does, leaving the White House. Well, the following year, John Adams becomes president. John Adams, in the following year, writes a letter to the militia of Massachusetts in which he says, our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to govern any other. The idea of America, our Constitution is built on giving freedom to the people. But freedom only works if we have a moral foundation. Because you give freedom to immoral people, it looks like Chicago any weekend, right? Like that's not a good scenario, right? Freedom only works when you have a moral foundation, and they acknowledged a moral foundation comes through religion. And to be clear, when they talked about religion, they're talking about the Judeo-Christian faith. And when they talk about morality, they're talking about the morality learned from the Bible. So without faith, without Christianity, without the Bible, this whole thing won't work. And I would challenge you that this is not just a kind of presupposition that we have. I would encourage you, go back and read from their own writings, because if we spend more time there, you would see this. In fact, we have a website, wallbuilders.com, where you can go and you can find out so much of this. We have documented, footnoted so many things. We have a book series called The American Story, where we go through and tell so many of these stories, documented, footnoted, more than 1,000 footnotes in each. We also have what's called the Founder's Bible, where it shows the connection of faith, the Bible, the Word of God with the Founding Fathers. What's interesting, the Founding Fathers quoted the Bible more than any other source, historically. 34% of all of the quotes in their writings come from the Bible. The most quoted book of the Bible in the Founders' writings was Deuteronomy. It's where Moses is reminding the Israelites of God's standards, of God's commands, and God's principles and God's ways. And it's what the Founding Fathers use, quoting more than anything else. Well, in the Founders' Bible, we actually put their quotes by the verses they're quoting, so you can see how they're literally using the Bible as they're shaping the ideas and principles of America. Let me close with a couple of Bible thoughts. So the Bible tells us in Psalms 127:1, except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Why am I going here? Because in the midst of what you are doing, I applaud you for coming down and doing this. I hope you have so much fun as you go through this process. I wish more Americans would do this and learn and understand the process behind it. But in the midst of learning the process, the Founding Fathers knew something that I think a lot of modern politicians forget. As much as we would support the amendment process, and I think there's some amendments we desperately need, if you fix amendments and we don't restore some foundational issues, you're only delaying the inevitable, right? If God's not a part of what we're doing, it's not ultimately going to be successful. Even if we change amendments, even if we get stuff done, okay? Now, let me give another thought. The Bible tells us in Proverbs 14:34 that righteousness exalts a nation. This idea that we're going to make America great again, you can only make her great again if you know what made her great in the first place. The thing that made us different was our faith foundation, religion and morality, more than anything else. Yeah, constitutional republic, checks and balances, separation of powers. Yes, a lot of fundamental things, but the Constitution was built on the ideas of the Declaration. The Declaration was understanding there's a God who gave rights and government exists to protect those rights. If we don't understand this righteous thought, that there's a moral component to success, then we're going to be wrong. But the last thing I would encourage is, our name Wall Builders comes from the Bible book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was the one that called people, come, let's rebuild this wall. Part of the challenge to rebuild the wall, people said it can never be done. It's too big, right? There's so much going on. In fact, the people that should have been, at times, his biggest cheerleaders, Nehemiah's biggest cheerleaders, were his biggest opposition. Okay? Take that for what it is, right? But Nehemiah, he just called for whoever was willing. He said, anybody that's willing to be on the team, come live inside the city, and let's just rebuild where you can. And people began to rebuild in their own backyard. And what happened is, what people thought was impossible in 52 days was completed. When people did not focus on the big picture, they focused on where they were. Part of what leads to success, if we will focus on where God has planted us, right? In every one of our communities, in every one of our states, right, in our local level, if we will focus on the local, well, all of a sudden we can solve the national if we solve all the local. Don't be overwhelmed by the national. Rather, roll up our sleeves and let's get to work. We cannot succeed without God. We have to have a moral component. But once we know there's a God, we know we need a moral component, then it's time to roll up our sleeves and get to work. Thank you guys for what you're doing. My pleasure being with you. I'm going to turn it back over.
That was amazing. Now, I got to see it live, and I was amazed when I saw it live, as was everybody in the room. You got to see it on tape. I just got to see it on tape with you. I'm equally impressed, if not more impressed, the second time. How does he talk that fast? How does he remember all that stuff? And how does he cram all that information in such a short period in a way that I feel like I can actually consume it? And now you know why I love Tim Barton and David Barton and Wall Builders so much. If you're interested in getting involved with Wall Builders, getting more of their materials, I recommend The American Story, Volume 1 and 2, a great basic American history. real American history instead of the stuff your kids or grandkids might be being taught in school right now. You can get that at their Wall Builders website. I recommend going there, buy as many books as you can, and read them all. And I hope you don't mind that we skipped the news this week and brought you a special presentation. I did it because I thought you would enjoy it. Anyway, that's all we've got for this week. We're not going to do Q&A. We're not going to do any of the political stuff. We're just going to say goodbye, and we're going to invite you to come back next week for a regular edition of the Battle Cry.